Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to kick off what is intended to be a bit of a triple bill of local election fever as I begin by discussing how the cult of Boris Johnson is already getting themselves ready to pounce in anticipation of a proper rout for Sunak when the full results are out. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So at this stage, the majority of results aren't out yet. The point at which I'm recording this is about a quarter. But there have been some interesting results in some quite prominent areas. But as I've said before, whether the results are good or bad for Labour or the Conservatives, that will be to an extent subjective. It's not like a general election where it's more clear-cut who's won. When the full results are in, there will be people looking at the data and they will proclaim it a triumph for Rishi Sunak. Other people will look at exactly the same data and say it was a disaster for him. Perception is everything in politics. The very fact that after such a terrible result in 2019, the Tories can still make net losses of hundreds and people will still believe it's a good result for them, as long as it is only a few hundred, not 1,000, speaks of the control which the Tory client media have over the public narrative in this country. I do not imagine that any of the non-Tory press who report on these results, whether in Britain or elsewhere, will talk about a positive result for the Conservatives. But Boris Johnson's cultists are already preparing their own narrative. A piece appeared in the Times yesterday. It was published just a few hours after the polls opened, which means largely written before they have opened, already talking about how the Democratic Conservative organisation, which is a Boris Johnson personality cult, is wanting to use the local election results to push their own agenda. And that agenda is, it wasn't so bad with Boris Johnson, was it? Make him leader again. Go on, you know, it makes sense. They don't care what the results are like. They will paint them as a disaster. In reality, they are a disaster already. But that's what they would have done regardless. And as I say, before even a quarter of the councils had declared this morning, they already had some material. Labour have taken the crucial battleground of Medway, but the Liberal Democrats took the real Tory areas of Windsor, Maidenhead, Eton. Quick, close it down before the next election. Cite the unmanageable infestation of rats there. Now, I've said in advance of today, people shouldn't get too excited about the early results, even though I'm quite excited, because not only do we not have the majority of seats declared yet, but the ones counted overnight were never going to be the good news results for the Conservatives. You know, they've made a few gains, but net losses are pretty bad. But the nature of the places lost by the Conservatives is just not a good omen for the rest of the day. Sunak has basically lost key areas of the red and blue wall. Now, you can sort of imagine someone like Rishi Sunak not really appealing to the red wall voters who flocked to Boris Johnson and Brexit. He's tried, I talked yesterday, he's tried putting on Cockney accents. He's tried talking about tea. He's tried filling up a car, but it hasn't really worked. He is out of touch. And it's gonna struggle to make a connection with the red wall voters. But where does he stand if he can't even appeal to traditional forelock-tugging Conservatives in the shires? You know, is it a case of trying to win over both populations and losing both instead? Because I've said on more than a few occasions, I think the problem with the Tory culture wars is that although you can see them appealing to certain voters in the red wall, not enough to retain those seats. But those same culture wars, it's not like they're a neutral issue for the so-called Conservatives with a small c. We're seeing signs that they are turning away from the nasty party. Now, they have got the Liberal Democrats to turn to, and it looks like they've been doing so. If Sunak had adopted policies which would have said tackle the problems with sewage dumping instead of pushing legislation which criminalises peaceful protest and breaks international law, he will have done badly in the red wall. He won't have been really doing anything to appeal in the red wall, but he may have held ground in more traditionally Tory areas. I have wondered before, has Sunak trapped himself in a strategy that means not appealing enough in the red wall to win, but weakening the blue wall to the point where that could be lost? On the evidence so far, I think it's a real risk. In fact, Jonathan Gullis, one of the prominent red wall culture trogs, saw Labour gain a huge swing in his neighbourhood. Labour already held seats there, but the margin is now absolutely enormous. Huge swing. Turns out people there don't care about small votes after all, but their shrinking living standards. But losing previously Labour areas is one thing. Losing strongholds is another, even if it is mostly to the Liberal Democrats. Of course, Sunak losing safe local elections to the Lib Dems, not as serious as losing them to Labour. The Lib Dems always do well in local elections. As the one thing you can always say ahead of a local election, will Labour do well? Will the Conservatives do well? If you were to ever, no one ever says, will the Lib Dems do well? They always do well. They always do well. As both the beneficiaries of protest votes, because people more easily flip from Conservative to Lib Dem than to Labour, but also because getting Lib Dem councils is a realistic aim for your vote. But come the general election, the Lib Dems, they can't afford to target that many seats, and many voters will see the contest in a general election as between Labour and the Conservatives nationally, even if their local choices are between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. So many will flip back to the Tories, not because they're not aligning more with the Lib Dems, but because they want to stop Labour. You know, that being said, Sunak will be making a very weak argument if he tries to use that line in defence after today's results. If he's losing support in red and blue wall seats, even more support than May lost, because remember, the default position, when we talk about net losses here, the default position is that these same seats were up in 2019. Theresa May, that was the second worst result in local elections for the Conservatives ever in terms of net losses. So the net losses were already huge the last time these seats were contested. So to have further net losses, particularly large net losses this time, is an absolute disaster. That is really bad for Sunak's credentials, even though he will try and spin it otherwise. And you couple this with the fact that despite all the excitement in the Tory press about the polls narrowing Labour, it was all bollocks, just like I said it was at the time. It's just fluctuations. Labour have been ticking up in the most recent polls again. The gap is way lower than when Truss was taunting that lettuce. Absolutely, of course it is. But it is still Labour in the we're going to win the election with an outright majority territory. Now, I will make a little prediction here, because the Conservatives have lost some poll rating recently to the Lib Dems. Of course they have. They've been getting more of a spotlight in the media on them because of the local elections, and just because of the local elections, people have been thinking towards the Lib Dems a bit more. Tends to happen. That means they will inevitably get it back when the dust settles. The Tory client media can then always use that to go mad about another resurgence if they want. But it may be swimming against the tide if the cult of Johnson manages to land any blows over the next week. Remember, Tory MPs are backing Sunak as the best chance to save their seats. Yes, absolutely, I can believe a majority may prefer his pragmatism to Johnson's recklessness, but their top priority is remaining on the gravy train. If they can be persuaded that Sunak really is worse than Johnson, whether it's a reasonable analysis or not, then the party infighting which the Windsor Framework Agreement seemed to nullify could still re-emerge. Cult of Johnson are holding a conference a week tomorrow. The aim is clear: persuade people that Johnson needs to make a triumphant return to Downing Street to save the election. You never should have got rid of him in the first place. It won't happen, of course. Not enough Tory MPs seem to be quite that stupid. But if enough of them are, it could still pose problems for Sunak. Remember what brought Boris Johnson down in the first place? In theory, what you'll see people cite is it was the Chris Pincher scandal coming off the back of a whole series of other scandals which had destroyed Johnson's credibility with the public. But that's not what he made him offer his resignation, because he didn't care about all that. He still intended to remain in place. What did for him was his own MPs refusing to support his government. Now, I don't expect Sunak to be unable to fill ministerial positions, but if a large enough group blocked his legislation, he'd have nowhere to go. The last attempted serious rebellion was against his Windsor framework. That fizzled out into nothing. But when the full election results are in, will Tory MPs, nervous about what it means for their own prospects next year, start to wonder if maybe Johnson would be a bit better after all. And if they do, will they be prepared to attack their own tentative party unity to press the issue? Because I don't seriously think there's going to be another change of leader. But if Sunak can't govern, there may be a much earlier general election. Remains to be seen, of course. I still think it's unlikely. But the general trend of results so far doesn't really indicate that Sunak's going to have the confidence of his party afterwards. Because I'll just finish off with one last thought. We know that the Tories have their strategy wrong here. Of course they do. This is a disaster. They're desperately trying to tell voters what the important issues are, instead of asking voters what the important issues are and addressing that. It's failed. I've also said in the past that I believe Sunak is just playing the culture wars to secure enough authority in his party in order to slowly drift back towards sensible ground for the general election. The Windsor framework definitely gave him a boost in authority. But if these election results take it away again, he's back to square one. This summer will be key. He needs to start moving towards the general election strategy. Does he feel confident enough, for example, to get rid of the chief culture warrior in his cabinet, Suella Braverman? She is surely a material threat to his ability to fight on ground where the voters are. If he keeps having to adopt short-term measures for the sake of unity or short-term gains in the polls, there'll come a point where it's too late to tilt ahead of next year's election. And next year's election will be about the economy and the state of public services. It won't be about small votes. He needs to be able to claim that these local elections are a sign that he's turning things around. If he cannot impose that narrative on his own party at least, and preferably the country, I struggle to see how he has any long-term strategy here. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I'm intending to look at some of the stats and further results in the second video today, when we should hopefully have most of them in. But until then, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.